talk about what happens when you ask Python to run your program. When you installed Python, one of the main things that you were installing was something called the Python interpreter. The Python interpreter is a program that can read your Python code. It understands Python. It takes what is essentially a text file, even though we save it with a py extension. It's just plain text, and it reads that and figures out what machine instructions are necessary to fulfill the tasks outlined in your program. So the interpreter reads our code and prepares it for execution. It begins by checking syntax. When you look at the program, you can see that it's really quite formalized. For example, this quote absolutely must be there, or there's going to be some sort of error, and you can see my Sublime editor is even telling me there's a problem. If something is missing from the syntax, Python's going to notice it. So the very first thing that the interpreter does is check our program for syntax to make sure that it just looks valid, because any one little character missing will cause the interpreter to stop and give us what we call a syntax error. We'll talk about that in a moment. After checking the program for syntax, Python then converts your code into a machine-readable representation called bytecode. This bytecode isn't readable by humans, but the machine can execute it. And so that is actually when the program runs and does the calculations that we're asking it to. When Python executes your code, it's executing each statement in sequence. This program consists of 5 statements. Each statement either allocates memory or processes that memory in some way. In the first 3 statements, we see an integer, a float, and a string object are assigned to names. That means that Python is going to allocate that memory. Then on line 9, we're calculating some value based on 2 of the values that we stored earlier. So my int, an integer 15, and my float, a float for 15.0, are being summed up to make a new float called this sum, which will be 30.0, and that will also be a float. When executing the code, Python goes line by line from top to bottom, which means that when we're reading the code, we can emulate what Python is doing by saying first line 2, then line 4, line 6, line 9, and then finally line 11. These lines are always executed in sequence, and so we can always know what is happening at any given moment and which line will be executed next. All of this is done dynamically during the program run, which means that we could never say something like this. This would actually get us something called a name error, which means that the value or the variable name was not found. It hasn't been allocated yet. It hasn't been assigned yet. And if we try to refer to a variable before it was assigned, we'll get a name error exception. In other words, this sum is not a name that Python understands yet. Of course, you do see that on line 11, Python is being told about this sum and is being asked to allocate a new object and then assign it to this name, this sum. But it doesn't really know that until it gets to line 11. So when it gets to line 9, it's going to be confused. Another thing to understand about this allocation, and especially about these variable names, is that it's done dynamically, which means that at any given moment and in any given statement, I can reassign any value I'd like. Here, I'm taking the name myXX and I'm reassigning a new object to myXX. This is what we call dynamic variable assignment, which means that it's happening line by line as the code executes. So the point of this video is to make you aware of what Python is doing when it executes your code. It's first checking to see if the code is valid syntax, and it's then converting that code to bytecode, When we read our code, we can emulate what Python is doing by going line by line, statement by statement, and saying, okay, now Python's allocating an int, now it's allocating a float, now a string, now it's summing up those two to create a new float, and finally it's printing the float. One last note on the syntax error. Because this is the very first thing that Python does, Python is going to check your code for syntax mistakes. A syntax error is very easy to fix. Here I'm just going to create a syntax error. Now, of course, my editor is reminding me that there's a problem here. That is not Python talking. That is just my editor that noticed that I made a mistake. When I try to run the code, Python gives me something called a syntax error. This is the simplest error to correct. It simply means that you should look at the line in question, and you can see it's being highlighted right here, and look at the code carefully to see if it's the correct syntax. It'll take time for you to become familiar with correct syntax, so what you'll need to do is look at a coding example that's in the slides or exercises or homeworks and compare your example to mine. See what's the same or different, and hopefully by making a careful appraisal of what you're seeing, you'll be able to correct the error.